The experts are not your friend. They never have been. If you understand that, it's time to both help your fellow man to understand it and also fight until it's broadly understood institutionally. Public health is inherently untrustworthy, and everything they say should be presumed both wrong and likely a lie until proven otherwise beyond reasonable doubt through sources and means that are explicitly not governmental. Ultimately, it's government science that has to be delegitimized first and foremost. 99% of scientists agree with whomever funds them. The rest of 1% lose their funding. But how to do that if you don't have power? Well, as it turns out, individuals and small groups can project a lot more power than they are being led to believe. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. So, in the previous episode I laid out the reason for why delegitimizing experts and those amplifying the noise is a necessary shift in the mindset. In this episode, I'll focus on the practicality of implementing this. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're right or not, nor does it matter how many likes or followers your social media accounts got. What matters is this: how many amplifiers of illegitimate so-called expert nonsense have stopped amplifying that noise, and at what cost? The cost part is important here too, not only because the idea of this guide is to use legal tools and avoid violence, but also because there is such a thing as diminishing returns. So for instance, if removing an expert so he or she could no longer harm society results you in working for 10 years or you being in serious legal troubles, then the cost is too high. So in this guide, I'll try to also introduce these trade-offs into the analyses. Keep in mind that this is a particular application. Most of what I'm about to say applies to almost any political project, which is why I'm probably going to get some angry emails after this video. You see, political operatives rarely appreciate when someone is giving out trade practices. Now, it is impossible to lay out all strategies for everyone in the world, though I will separately write one for my own country and I'll gladly provide tailored details per country and private consultations. But here are the general directions: coalition building and expansion, politico-administrative lawfare, judicial activism, direct action, active measures, boycott and divestment, local, not national or global, personal first, institutional later, persistently with great joy. The goal is to discredit and, where applicable, remove and replace in office anyone who has supported and amplified COVID-19 and more widely public health nonsense, and for it to be widely known, particularly to those individuals, that the reason for their woes is their personal involvement in this extremist and illegitimate narrative. The way to do this is to inflict maximum damage possible onto these individuals personally. As long as it's legal, nothing is off limits. Their business, their personal finance, their family relationships, their contracts, their public image, you name it. Friendly reminder that nothing was off limits for them either. These people filled the psychiatric wards with children with their policies, taught children through the mass media that they're murderers. Only one German newspaper apologized for that. They lobbied for fascistic politics and policies that would destroy your business, your family, and your ability to exist. Yes, this is a video on how to take revenge using legal tools in both a coordinated and non-coordinated fashion. Alright, so let's go through each of the 8 directions. Now, please keep in mind, all of the 8 directions are to be considered simultaneously rather than one after the other, or at least that's what we do at Freedom Alternative Network, and I will provide some examples too. So, coalition building and expansion. Non-leftists in the United States have a tremendous opportunity at hitting hard against two categories of illegitimate experts: public health and educational experts. There's already a very good effort building up to discredit, expose, and undermine the atrocity euphemistically called public education system. And it's working. It's already getting under their skin. The president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randi Weingarten, she's now complaining that people like Christopher Rufo, which by the way you should be following on Twitter, are successfully encroaching upon the credibility of the organized crime syndicate that the public education system really is. Public education, just like public health, is an enemy of liberty and civilization, and it's full of experts that are just as illegitimate as the public health experts and just as arrogant and totalitarian. These are the people who legitimately believe your 7-year-old is old enough to change his sex and you, the parent, shouldn't even be informed about it. The essence of coalition building and expansion is for the activists to assess whether certain existent groups or causes may be helpful in the current political project of delegitimizing so-called experts. Quite frankly, I would explore to see whether I can use the feminists on this task too. I don't know, maybe an expert is too white and patriarchal or something. Don't laugh. It worked with building the backlash against the trans issue, which is now mainstream. Part of that effort involved bringing in some of the feminists in the chorus. It didn't even cost much. All we had to do was to introduce an additional narrative on so-called female-to-male trans teenagers. There aren't that many of those, but they do exist, and after all, discussing about them too certainly didn't hurt the main cause. Same goes with allying with certain religious groups, although not all. Religious groups tend to naturally distrust expert authority, but that tendency is rarely instrumentalized in political activism. Also, be careful, religious groups rarely sign up for a revanchard agenda, but they do sign up for a defensive one. So the framing for religious groups must be kept in that register. Defend our churches from being closed down by sanitary fascists, defend our children from being indoctrinated with extremist ideologies concocted by illegitimate experts, and so on and so forth. So, homework. Make a list of useful groups and then start approaching every one of them with useful ideas and policies. I do that routinely. At least 3 times a month I write to a new group with a proposal. Now, oftentimes many groups remain dormant for reasons that have nothing to do with their beliefs. Either their de facto leader is away, or they've gone tired, mostly because they failed to observe Saul Alinsky's rule number 7, a tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag, which is something routinely observed in religious groups. They become predictable, and predictable means boring, and boring means low appeal. Also, part of this direction involves outright takeover of some groups. We welcomed several dozens of new people in our ranks at Freedom Alternative Network over the last 2 years, most of them by simply taking over de facto. Of course, that comes with some trade-offs, but in the end it works out quite fine. But perhaps the most important on this coalition building direction is to avoid, for as long as possible, to build a unifying institution. This is what the Querdenken movement got right in Germany. Now, they got other directions wrong, but they got this one right. Querdenken isn't an NGO or a political party or one Facebook group. It's a collection of very diverse individuals converging on just a few key points, one of them being that public health experts are fundamentally illegitimate and wrong. This is what terrifies the so-called experts. The last thing they want is for this to be replicated, which is why this is exactly what you need to replicate. For instance, over the last 2 years, we helped in various ways with protests organized by all sorts of people. Now, I disagree on almost everything with more than 2/3 of them, but will support all of them again if an opportunity presents itself to take down yet another expert. Now, next direction, politico-administrative lawfare. Now, here's one of my favorite examples of this, and it's probably one of my favorite examples because I contributed to it. In December 2021, frustrated that approximately nobody in Romania was keen on the COVID-19 shots, and even more frustrated that even those who had been keen on it were a lot less keen when it came to their own children, a few doctors, championed by experts, decided to make a Christmas tree out of used clot shot vials. This is how it looked. The move was roundly applauded by the media and amplified on social media by the official blue-checked government account, and all the NPCs gathered up to applaud and regurgitate some more sanitary fascist propaganda and extremist disinformation about the purported benefits of the clot shot. Yours truly and a few others, no more than 20 people really, headed towards the administrative code and something called Law Number 211 from 2011, which is part of the body of law that regulates medical waste. Armed with that knowledge, we petitioned the National Environmental Guard, which is the Romanian equivalent of the EPA, and then made some phone calls to pressure the institutions, all as concerned citizens. And lo and behold, just a few hours later, the news dropped. Those who organized it got slapped with more than $20,000 in fines, and the fines were issued on individuals, not institutions. Moreover, the transport company who helped with this had its activity shut down for 3 months for not properly observing the legal regime for transporting medical waste. 9 months later, 2 of the fines stood up in court. The third one is still on trial. I hope the third one stays as well, and those end up having their money forcefully taken from their accounts, because it is important that everyone who contributed to sanitary fascist propaganda to suffer personally for it. But more important than that, the news that someone got fined for upholding branch Covidianism triggered all of the usual suspects and also woke up quite a few in the apparatus. You see, if it can happen to visible propagandists of the regime, what will it happen to a teacher forcing kids to wear face diapers? Or a low-tier journalist who is already in the crosshairs of the regime? It got a lot of them thinking. December 2021 was a great month overall. 10 days after this incident, the parliament was stormed a little bit. Just enough to scare the living bejesus out of the branch Covidians in the parliament, but not enough to cause any legal trouble for basically anyone. Now that is what I call proper direct action. The point of this direction, of politico-administrative lawfare, is this: identify pre-existent political conflicts within a bureaucracy and exploit them to your own advantage. Our little legal stunt with the Christmas tree worked also because we knew the environmental agency was led by someone who utterly despised those that ran the specific vaccination center. Yes, we had the law on our side, but we also identified correctly an additional source of conflict, and that would make this more likely to work. And it doesn't always work out like this, but sometimes it does. Since March 2020, I personally engaged in thousands of such moves, and collectively in tens of thousands, our network, at the very least tens of thousands. Not all political administrative lawfare moves are created equal. Some, for instance, are for the longer goal. For example, every country in Europe has an institution that is tasked to regulate broadcasting. Since 1995, they even have a central organism called the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, which they describe it as, quote, a forum for international and informal discussion and exchange of views between regulatory authorities in the broadcasting field in Europe, unquote. Now, in most countries, these regulatory authorities actually have quite a lot of power on what can and cannot be said on TV and on radio, albeit not on the internet or the printed press. And they can issue fines or even shut down a TV station for violation of its rules. So, we took the time to file complaints against a particularly illegitimate expert who kept on distributing extremist mis- and disinformation about the Wuhan cough. This guy satisfied pretty well the media's insatiable desire for apocalyptic content, so he used to be called in quite routinely. The first round of complaints filed against the TV station hosting him had no effect. Neither did the second round. After the third round, his appearances dropped to half of what they used to be. At least 2 TV stations stopped even mentioning him altogether, let alone invite him. By the 6th round of complaints, he was essentially back to his Facebook sandbox. Now, of course, we observed rule number 13. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. So in addition to that, we also made sure to leak his real resume, to popularize. Not even his wife was following his Branch Covidian nonsense, and sought new allies even in the mainstream press to dig as much dirt as possible. Heck, we even created and then popularized mocking terms derived from his name. The point being that not only these directions have to be taken all at once, but also to understand that when you engage in administrative lawfare, some actions have a delayed effect, sometimes even more than a year later. For instance, in September 2020, I went to videotape the opening ceremony of the school year in a small town at a high school where the superintendent belonged to the National Liberal Party, the party that implemented the 2020 lockdown. I went as officially credentialed journalist with all of the stamps and approvals and whatnot. She didn't let me videotape citing COVID concerns. Okay, so then I filed a FOIA request to have her put in writing exactly which administrative rules I was breaking. So she replied in writing that there were no rules that I was breaking, she just felt that way. Armed with that response, I ran to file a criminal complaint against her personally for anti-constitutional behavior and abuse of power. You see, censoring the press is a crime. More than 2 years later, last month basically, the first hearing took place. I didn't expect, and I don't expect anyone will go to jail, but I do expect her reputation to be tarnished and the criminal investigation to be a drag on her career. The process is the punishment. That was and is the point. So, the lesson on politico-administrative lawfare is this: be patient. Some actions yield results even 2 years later. Politico-administrative lawfare is how the bureaucrats, especially the illegitimate experts, protect themselves because they rely on you, the pleb, not to pursue them to the bitter end. And that's why they're so terrified in so many countries now. Because suddenly, quite a few plebs decided to say, you know what, fine, let's play this game for 3 years if in the end that means you suffer. You're not supposed to know that you have rights and prerogatives in administrative law. Direction 3. Judicial activism. Now, I talked about this multiple times throughout the years. See my February 2021 video titled The Legal Case Against RT-PCR Tests, or my May 2020 conversation with Andrei Mogescu titled On the Constitutional Deficit, or most of the World Sofa Report episodes, which routinely covered the judicial activism direction of attack for normal people against illegitimate forces such as public health. When I say that all of these directions have to be thought of as in conjunction with each other, I really mean it, and judicial activism illustrates this the best. You can't learn all of the tricks, so you have to team up with that subsegment of society that is obsessed with legalese. Luckily, we were able to tap into that segment during the so-called pandemic. The people obsessed with legalese aren't always the most sociable bunch, so it's not an easy task to get them on your side, but you absolutely have to try your best, because without such people, judicial activism is essentially impossible. You can do administrative lawfare even without these people, but it's nearly impossible to launch a successful constitutional challenge without at least some input from these people. And speaking of which, constitutional challenges aren't as scary as sadly too many plebs seem to think. In 2019, it was impossible to convince anyone to help with the constitutional challenge. The whole madness of the Branch Covidians barely moved the needle. With great difficulty, we did find a few people willing to at least give it a shot, but man, how hard it was. It worked, and in the end everyone was happy, but god damn it, how hard it is to get people to use the tools at their disposal. In essence, judicial activism means suing the state or institutions or even other people on principle rather than for money. This is a very difficult thing to do in the United States, but it's stupidly cheap to do in Europe. And through the so-called pandemic, quite a few Europeans learned that, although in my view, still not enough. But at least they learned some of it. In the near future, though, we should be looking at suing individuals and institutions, including and especially private institutions, on both principle and for money. For instance, a lot of these so-called experts have in fact plagiarized some of their work. They should be sued into oblivion for that. Not because I give a damn about plagiarism, but because it hurts them career-wise and as a public perception. You see, it's not defamation or libel if a court says it's true. Recently, a restaurant closed for good in my area. You see, its paperwork was not in order. Now, I didn't care about the paperwork when I filed multiple complaints against that establishment, but I did care that in January 2021, two of my friends couldn't eat in the evening because they were not properly QR coded. "Rules are rules, comrade," said the owner as he was escorting my friends out in the cold at -10 degrees Celsius. "Rules are rules, comrade," is what I told to the owner as the agents were filling out the paperwork for the permanent closure order. If you enforce this lunacy, you don't deserve a normal life, and definitely don't deserve to operate a business on the goodwill of the majority. Because here, in my neck of the woods, people like me are the majority, and someone has to enforce the will of the majority, which is to not be QR coded. Now this should be extended. All establishments that swallowed this lunacy hook, line and sinker are fair game for retribution. It can be on anything. Maybe they didn't file their tax returns correctly, or maybe you filmed something untoward in their kitchen, or maybe they mistreat their employees in a legal sense. Any small infraction, no matter how petty, should be filled in a complaint and get that said business in trouble. Yes, weaponize the institutions against the enforcers of branch Covidianism. It's only fair. They weaponized everything against you, so why shouldn't they feel some heat? Same goes with doctors. For instance, I now keep tabs on 25 doctors waiting for them to make a mistake. Any mistake. From minor stuff like filing the wrong paperwork, and yes, I'm monitoring that closely, to big stuff like hidden contracts or bribes. Do I care in general that they take bribes? No, not really. Anti-corruption sentiment has never caught me. I take corruption as a basic fact of life because that's exactly what it is. For the purposes of the political project, the current political project, anti-corruption can and must be weaponized, however, against the individuals that are part of an illegitimate operation, such as the so-called public health system or so-called public health in general. Again, the process is the punishment. Disruption is the point. What I'm saying here, basically, is apply rules number 3 and 4. Whenever possible, go outside the expertise of the enemy, and rule number 4, make the enemy live up to his own book of rules. Or, as I usually say, I didn't make the rules, I just got here. If the law says that the doctor has to file 59 papers to 12 institutions, and if he files 58 papers to 11 institutions, that's a crime. Then it's fair game to levy complaints and make his life harder. Also, this works for individual private practices as well. Is their building properly following fire code and has all of its paperwork up to date? Let's explore. This information is public or easily obtainable via FOIA requests. If the building is not legally impeccable, and almost none are, by the way, then look for ways to weaponize an institution against that. If it's not possible, and sometimes it's not possible, then at least publicize the information and disseminate it into the community. I know the rallying cry can be, how can Dr. X be all about safety when he calls people into an unsafe building? If you can afford to gather even 100 people to protest in front of that building, even better. In smaller communities, that can be devastating for the reputation of that doctor. Be creative. Judicial activism is not just successful constitutional challenges, albeit those matter quite a lot. It's also small things. The courts can do a lot more than you are being led to believe by the corporate media and the regime shills. Direction 4. Direct action. Well, this one is easy. Direct action is basically what a lot of people already did. Sticker campaigns, physical protests, booths, or attending meetings in communities. The latter should be done more often. A lot of the influence of illegitimate forces comes through these little publicized but nonetheless public committees. Conservatives in the USA have recently found out that school boards are in fact obscure subcommittees with a lot of influence that nobody votes for. So they started voting and attending these committees, and lo and behold, now big-moneyed organizations such as teachers' unions are shitting their pants. Identify these places in your community. There are more of these out there. For instance, in Europe, most city halls actually have open council meetings in which regular citizens can not just attend, but even speak and propose stuff. When was the last time you spoke to the mayor or at least an alderman in your community? If the answer is more than a year ago, or even worse, never, then you're not involved enough and you can do better. Same goes to the county and regional level. Oftentimes, quite a lot of power is vested in obscure subcommittees that are nonetheless public. Identify those in your community, grab 2 friends, and go! Oftentimes, a group of just 5 decently articulated people can have an outsized influence on local policy and can punch way above their weight. In many places, you won't even face opposition because bureaucrats don't even bother to organize their own because they expect you, the non-leftist normal human, to never show up. And routinely, unfortunately, they're right. Stickers and protests are fine, but they're not enough. Direct action is also getting involved in shaping policy and pushing for it, and oftentimes it's doable even without running for office yourself. Direction 5. Active measures. Okay, so this is one of the 2 where some internet activity is necessary. You will notice that so far I only mentioned exclusively offline activities. And in general, this whole thing involves, for the most part, getting your ass off the chair and off the internet and into the real world. The left is slowly starting to have serious problems with its social agenda, precisely because they seriously believed that Twitter is real life. In the real world, much fewer people, or indeed statistically nobody, believe in sanitary fascism, teenage medical transgender surgery, which is a nicer way of saying mutilating and castrating children for the profits of doctors and the pharma industry, or a plethora of other extremist ideas being put in so much legislation nowadays. However, when conducting active measures, there is an online component too. So, for instance, in the online environment, messages that denigrate, delegitimize, ridicule, marginalize, question, or dismiss experts must be propagated a lot more. Also, messages such as "you should start thinking of an excuse why you supported sterilizing children" or "delaying speech and language development in children" should be made a lot more prominent. The most outrageous and false claims by the experts, and there is no shortage of those, especially in the last 2 years, should be rehashed repetitively to as many unsuspecting people as possible and as often as possible, preferably to convey the message that experts are illegitimate. Also, during active measures, spin is, of course, part of the game. These people destroyed 1 or 2 years out of your children's lives, so you can rest assured that I won't be exercising strict ethics when I write counter-propaganda. So, for instance, if you find a statement that is absolutely honk, don't be afraid to reframe it as being representative of the whole political party or the whole institution that that person belongs to. I will not stop anytime soon from calling the Romanian National Liberal Party the party of jailing people for sneezing. Now, did the National Liberals jail anyone for sneezing? No. But their most visible representative in early 2020, the Internal Affairs Minister, said in an interview that if you see someone sneezing without a muzzle on, you should be calling 112 or 911 for my American friends, because that is a felony, and that was a direct quote. So, the head of law enforcement said you should be in jail for sneezing. There is no reason the entirety of the National Liberal Party shouldn't be having its name tarnished with this, because nobody in the party protested to this line of communication. Silence is complicity. Also, active measures can and should be connected to active measures and direct action, because sticker or flyer campaigns in the community with the most egregious comments by the illegitimate forces should be distributed regularly. This has an effect on community. It slows down the forgetting process. You'd be surprised how many things people forget, if not constantly remembered. For instance, a month from now, after I come back from Poland, inshallah, we want to do a campaign exactly like this. The illegitimate in their words. A flyer with 3 or 4 quotes with names and position. That's it. No punchline, no call to action or vote, no nothing. Just a friendly reminder that these people exist and haven't yet been made to pay for their crimes. This tactic worked great in the campaign for Brexit, worked quite well in Hungary. I saw it used successfully in 2002 and 2003 here. That's when I integrated it into my toolbox. Now, keep in mind, it works if you repeat it or if it's big enough and is also doubled by efforts on other fronts, such as calls for resignations. For instance, in 2003, here in my neck of the woods, egregious quotes from targeted people in the regime were distributed and then a campaign to have those people resign was mounted. Most of them ended up resigning, and without them, the regime, at the time Nastase's Social Democrats, was weakened in some local seats, just enough for them to lose the election in 2004. Basically, what I'm saying is, do a Libs of TikTok. What Libs of TikTok is doing on Twitter is basically just another version of active measures. That's why leftists are so terrified of her, because she's using a tried and tested playbook that has a very good track record of working against intended targets. In active measures, the only limit is your morality, so I will not say where the limit is, because everyone will have their own limit. I will say, though, that when it comes to doctors, public health officials, and the enforcers of branch Covidianism, my only limit is the use of violence, except that nothing is off limits for me, because these people represent such a serious threat to liberty and civilization that it would simply be wrong to award them any more courtesy than they did to the majority in my country. So, for instance, I held a special place in my active measures for the illegitimate expert that called for the majority to be subjected to naked cold water showers just because they don't fancy Pfizer's product. Now, he is a bit bankrupt and in 3 separate civil lawsuits, soon a criminal investigations too. I won't stop until such vermin is punished. And my idea of punishment for such people means eternal illegitimacy, persistent shame, and lifelong poverty. Exactly what he and many people like him wanted to impose upon the majority. Now, I realize that not everyone is willing to be that vindictive, and I think that's quite unfortunate. The world would be a much better place if those willing to willingly representing totalitarianism would be subjected to personal and well-tailored punishment. So I'm not saying you should adopt such goals necessarily, but I am saying that active measures is an important component in the quest to delegitimize the regime's experts and authority. There is no reason for people like these should enjoy a normal life anytime soon. Okay, maybe not haunted forever, but surely at least a few years until we flatten the curve. Direction 6. Boycott and divestment. Now this one is pretty straightforward. Vote with your wallet. If you have any control or say over the spending of others, such as spouse, company, extended family, NGOs, etc., exercise the same caution. Want to buy something? Look up what they were saying between December 2020 and October 2021. Then make the decision accordingly. Also, this can be applied to people as well. I was recently tasked to review several resumes for a small company seeking to employ a few more people. The very first thing I did was to look them up on social media and set the search for the interval December 2020, October 2021. Half of them were branch Covidians. I threw their resumes straight through the shredder and then into the garbage disposal without even a second look. Then chose from the remaining half. They wanted to forbid your right to work forever, so I see no reason why I shouldn't help small companies avoid having to interact with such crazy. Soon I will be again in that position, and I will apply the same logic, maybe with a slightly extended interval. Same goes for donations. Any entity that has behaved in a branch Covidian way will not see a donation from me as long as the branch Covidians are not fired and blacklisted and a public apology issued. No forgiveness, no prisoners, no compromise. The limiting principle is, of course, public apology and firing of all those guilty. So, of course, by 2025 or maybe a bit later, most of those at fault will not be working in the same place. But until then, they're all fair game for boycott and divestment in all areas where such thing is possible at an individual level, and if possible, let them know about it too. Because that's also part of the process, just like in a normal court of law. It's important for the defendant not only to understand what is happening to him, but also why it is happening. This is important especially in North America, where universities, for instance, routinely require donations. And if you find yourself in that situation, politely decline and explain why, and also outline the limiting principle for you to resume donations. The limiting principle in that situation should be the firing of all professors and admin that supported draconian, illiberal, and unscientific, insane, and illegitimate policies. Because again, none of this is to be permanent, just enough to flatten the curve of illegitimate schmucks inflicting damage upon our civilization. Boycott goes into non-financial institutions too. So for instance, as a policy, we hold a blacklist of media organizations to which our people never speak with. Never. Under any circumstances, no matter the topic. We just let them know that we don't speak with Branch Covidian regime media and that they should go look for someone unmasked somewhere else. On several occasions, such responses, or similar ones, equally firm, triggered introspection into those reporters. A few of them ended up writing to us months later, telling us that they resigned upon realizing what their institution was doing. That is also good development. Depriving such institutions of talent is a financial loss for them in the end. Just look at what happened to CNN. So the point is this. Cold shoulder to anyone enabling the extremism of illegitimate experts. Direction 7. Local, not national or global. Now what I mean by this is more in the sense of all politics is local. Parliamentarians or congressmen may be on the national stage, but their votes come from local politics. So if you manage to press the local politics enough, the national stage necessarily follows. Not always though, but most of the time. Same goes for experts. They may be a blue check marked and getting a say on national or even international stage, but most of their power is local. Usually some political connection that got them in their position, and that connection is also very local most of the time. So when I say local, not national or global, I don't mean in the sense of abandoning focus on the national stage, but more like in the sense of retracting the connections back to the local level, or retracing the connections if you want, because that's where you can inflict the most damage, and also because if you leave these people without their local power base, all of their national and international bling bling usually goes away too. This is what many British blue check-marked public health experts are about to find out very soon, and quite brutally. That's why Devi Sridhar, for instance, chair of Global Public Health at Edinburgh University, is so keen on inconspicuously discussing about inflation and the cost of living crisis, while fuming at anyone discussing about the culpability of experts, like her, for instance, for the situation. But while Devi Sridhar will eventually be removed from her position, it's important to use the moment to further advance the policy position that university experts as people are illegitimate. It would be quite a shame if, on the premises of Edinburgh University, pamphlets would start circulating with the most vile and extremist quotes from Dr. Devi Sridhar. She literally said the English language is at fault for the Wuhan flu. I'm not joking, look it up. Also, she is an SNP aide, which means she also plays in the political realm. It would be quite a shame if she were to finally start being treated as a political actor rather than an expert. Because, you know, political actors are fair game for all sorts of nasty stuff, although in my opinion, experts should be fair game for a lot worse. At least politicians pay a price for being wrong, so on that alone, politicians are already morally superior to experts. Same goes for many doctors who were, and some continue to be, very stupid in public on various topics, be it Wuhan cough, so-called gender confirmation care, education, or really many other topics. Doctors, for the most part, especially in Europe, but also in many quarters of the United States, derive some of their power and stability through internal admin bureaucracy, a local union, political favors with the management, or a combination of these. This is true more often than not. So, following a local, not national or global direction, the activist should untangle that and attack the most vulnerable link and also use the existent conflicts. That's what I do every time I want to take down a doctor. There is always another doctor that hates my target, so that's the go-to source for information. And there's always another doctor and or potential director that is of another political party than my target, so that person is the vehicle through which the attack will be delivered. Then there's always a local blogger or community influencer that despises my target, so that person is the vehicle for active measures. By the time I'm done identifying all of the relevant links, the previously untouchable doctors becomes just another victim of the inherent dysfunctionalities of this largely immoral and illegitimate profession. So what I'm saying is this: don't be a revolutionary. Don't try to reform them or quote-unquote make things better for all. You won't succeed and you will be wasting your time. Use what you find to forward the goals of the political project and then move on. No point on dwelling too much on one individual. Also, one more thing. If you truly find one that is more immune to such tactics, put the case aside and move on to the next possible target. Get back to the supposedly immune one later on when you ran out of easier targets. Build experience with easier targets. Don't be Rambo going in unexperienced straight into harder targets. Direction 8. Personal first, institutional later. Here I'm just gonna paraphrase Professor Olavo de Carvalho. In order for an idea to succeed, people who hold that idea must physically replace those who oppose it. Power is personal first and institutional second. Some institutions are illegitimate, immoral, and inherently untrustworthy right from the get-go, such as the CDC or the ATF, but others are not illegitimate per se, but populated by people with terrible ideas. In the latter case, targeting individuals first is in itself a step to make the institution better. This is the case, for instance, with the police. A lot of law enforcement officers in many countries of Europe are legitimate targets in this guide. Riddling the police of obedient, stupid, and rewarding the questioning smarter ones who refuse to enforce sanitary fascism is a tiny step in the right direction. And I say this as someone who is not a big fan of the police, who for me will always be the militia. But nevertheless, even if you see them as militia, like I do, it is still preferable to have less insane militia than insane one. Besides, from a practical standpoint, abolishing the police is politically unfeasible, as the left is learning the hard ways these days. Also, judicially, holding the institutional accountable is mostly meaningless. Best you can hope for is to get some money off of them, but after long and expensive trials, that will drain your energy. However, if you go after individual police officers, not only you can also get, albeit indirectly, some money off of them, but you're also helping to punish the individual who's done wrong. On this endeavor, it's worth partnering up with local groups dealing with abuse by police. I know I did in the cases of 3 police officers in my town who were way too enthusiastic in enforcing COVID-19 lunacy. Turns out that a local anti-abuse group had 80% of the necessary information and evidence to not only get them kicked out from the force, but get them thrown out in jail too. I gladly fetched the remaining 20% for them, under the condition that they also mention COVID-19 abuses on the final record. All 3 of them are now in jail. The first one will be released in February 2023. None of them will work again in any law enforcement capacity ever. People hurt more and faster than institutions. And when engaging in activism as an individual or a small group, you can't afford to think of wide-sweeping reforms, because that takes a lot of resources you likely don't have. But definitely you can afford to think of replacing a few bad apples. And in time, you learn how this works and you get more effective. Don't let anyone tell you it's not possible, because it is possible. The first time I got a police officer in trouble was more than 20 years ago when I got fined for jaywalking at 2 a.m., specifically for not following traffic lights. Now, technically, the police was right. I had not followed traffic lights. Legally, however, they were wrong and I was right. The traffic lights shouldn't have been turned on according to the local ordinance that they broke by turning the traffic lights on and preying upon pedestrians to ramp up their budget. I did not relent and fought it in the courts for months. Everyone around me kept on telling me that it's cheaper to just pay the fine, which admittedly was next to nothing in the amount, and that there's no way a young marginal like me can beat the police in court, especially without expensive or fancy lawyers. But I did. And then, with the result, I filed a separate administrative complaint to the police's internal affairs bureaus. Few people know that in Europe, the police's internal affairs accepts petitions from citizens and can start investigations against a police officer based on that alone. In the end, the police officer was made to pay for the trial and, following internal affairs investigations, was also a bit relegated. A year later, he committed another, more serious abuse of power. Since he was now a repeat offender, he got kicked out of the force and stripped of benefits. At that time, it was rare for a police officer to have this happening to him. Very few citizens did what I had done. In my community, after I did it, 10 others started reading about how it's done. Turns out a lot more in the community had legitimate claims and beefs with certain police officers. Almost always, the same police officers. In 5 years, there were 50 individuals in the community being busy rooting out bad cops. Soon enough, the number of bad cops got lowered to almost zero, which really is the best you can hope for. You will not root out corruption all by yourself. You will not make institutions perfect. But with this approach, you may contribute to some of them at least marginally improving. And finally, the last direction, persistently with great joy. This one is actually inward, for the individual or small group, rather than outward. This is basically a nicer way of phrasing Sololinsky's rule number 6. A good tactic is one your people enjoy. Since the success of this strategy relies upon a small nucleus of very resilient and persistent people, the best way to keep focus is to only focus on what sits right with you. You will not be able to maintain focus to always dedicate 5 to 10 hours a week for the assignments necessary for this work unless you enjoy it. So, do you enjoy going to court? If not, then judicial activism is not for you. If you do, then see if you can pick up assignments from others as well. Do you enjoy filing complaints? I love it, actually. The documenting process is nearly identical to the one I go through when making most of my videos or podcasts, because I actually put context and sources on my complaints and emphasize that I won't take a bullshit bureaucratic reply for an answer. That's why I file most of the complaints. I don't even perceive it as work or activism. I just enjoy writing arguments with the intent to weaponize an institution against an individual who crossed me or my associates or friends. Sometimes I even put passion in my complaint writing, even though my days as a passionate enthusiast are long behind me. Do you enjoy putting up stickers? I don't actually, which is why I try to avoid having to do it myself. And while I don't shy away from doing it if it's necessary, I will always try my best to get another assignment and leave these things to the younger folk who also tend to enjoy this much more than I do. The point that I'm making here is that while all previous 8 directions are equally important, not all 8 are equally suited for every person. They can't be. So as a result, the individual should try to do mostly what he or she enjoys the most. Since it's not always possible, you sometimes have to do things you don't enjoy that much. But it matters if I go to court 20 times in a trimester rather than once. I will go once, I may even go twice, but I won't go 20 times. Luckily, I have been privileged enough to be able to move that burden to those who love this, but if you can't afford that, then the best course of action is to do the trade-off analysis and only take the judicial routes that involve the least amount of court appearances. What you should not do, however, is force yourself into doing things you don't enjoy for too long, because if you do, then frustration will accumulate and eventually you will want to drop the political project altogether. This stands true regardless of whether you're getting any compensation for your work or not. and I say this from experience, there is only a slight difference in time, because you think twice before leaving the project if you're getting any money from it, but most of the times the decision remains the same if you don't enjoy it. The business of political involvement is a taxing one, and most of the time it's a marathon rather than a sprint. Too many seem to think it's rather a sprint. It could be because most of the time the public only encounters the front face of political involvement, which tends to be obsessively concerned with the next election and appears to have little concern about anything else. Yes, for those people it is a sprint. But in order for the sprint to even be possible for those people, a much bigger army of marathonists have been running behind them. For Ron DeSantis, for instance, or Glenn Youngkin before him, to come up just in time with an appropriate policy on grooming in classrooms, marathonists like Rufo ran slowly for years before him to dig up that information, weaponize it, package it, and come up with the networking necessary to even make this possible. Similarly, for the politicians or even entire political parties that rose on the Wuhan cough madness, in order for them to rise, some others worked slower in the background to make that possible. So, pick your role, being mindful of this aspect. So yeah, that's basically how you do it. The specifics are easier to figure out by simply reading your local legislation, networking in your community, and applying practical thought to it. As long as you start with the correct mentality and cover as many of these directions as possible, the political project will have some success. In a group of 1, it is entirely possible to cover 5 or even 6 of them, albeit 3 of the 6 quite poorly. In a group of 5 people, you should be able to cover 7 or 8 of the 9, with at least 5 in an impeccable manner. After a while, it becomes routine. This is a skill that is just as much trained as it is learned. The first time you file a complaint as part of a political administrative lawfare operation, you will second guess and take forever until you actually finish the job. By the 50th time, you'll be having the paper done within 3 hours. By the 100th time, you'll wonder why is it so difficult for people to file 2 complaints per day? I'm serious. Once you develop your routine, it's like nothing. Anyway, I've spilled enough beans for a video, so I will, for now, stop here. Let me know what you think, share your experience if you've already tried some of these things, get on our Telegram groups or Discord server to discuss with the community some of these things. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and if you like what we do, consider supporting us. You get perks for that too. And with all of that being said, I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative. Cheers.